Hello everyone, I hope you're doing well today. In this video we're going to discuss chapter 16, which is general senses. So the last two chapters that we're going to cover are this chapter, which are the general senses, and chapter 17, which are the special senses. As they are appropriately named, the general senses provide information about senses that are more general, and the special senses refer to senses that we have such as our eyes, our ears, and our nose. So in chapter 16, we discuss how our bodies integrate sensory information coming in regarding pain, touch, and temperature. So the two words on this slide are often used interchangeably with each other. However, sensation and perception are two different things. Sensation can be described as our body's ability to be conscious of some type of change. Sensation comes from our sensory neurons, while perception is our own conscious interpretation of that sensation and the change that has occurred. So sensation more so refers to us being conscious of some type of change, while perception is us actually understanding what that change means. So as we've discussed in great detail by this point, sensory information makes its way into the central nervous system, where that sensory information can be understood. And once we understand what that sensory information means, we can produce some type of motor output to respond to that sensory information coming in. Now, when I say sensory information, I'm referring to all of the different types of senses that we have. Now, when I say sensory information, I'm referring to all of the different types of sensations that our body can monitor. But the phrase sensory information can be broken down even more specifically. So different types of sensations are referred to as sensory modalities. And this word is just referring to all of the different types of sensations that our bodies monitor, such as touch and pain, vision and hearing, as well as our sense of smell and our sense of taste. All of these sensory modalities are different ways that our bodies will monitor the external and internal environment. So you can see our special senses shown right here, which is our sense of vision, our sense of hearing and equilibrium, which both come from the ears, our sense of smell, and our sense of taste. These are the special senses, and these will be further covered in chapter 17. Now, the general senses, we can say, are a little bit more generalized. We have two groups within general senses, the somatic sensations and the visceral sensations. Somatic sensations refer to sensations about the external environment, and visceral senses refer to sensations from the internal environment. So the way that our bodies sense hunger is a type of visceral sense. And our body's way of regulating our own temperature is another type of visceral sense. Somatic senses refer to our body's ability to sense the external environment, in touch, in temperature, as well as in pain. So the somatic senses monitor sensory modalities in the external environment, and our visceral senses monitor sensations coming from our body's internal environment. Now, in order for our bodies to sense anything, we have to have some type of receptor that's monitoring whatever sensation we're talking about. Each sensory modality has its own sensory receptors. So vision information is received by the eyes. The eyes are the receptors for light that comes in and gives us our perception of vision. There will be special receptors that sense pain and other receptors that will sense touch as well. So each sensory modality is going to have its own sensory receptors that are specialized to monitor whatever that sensory modality is. So since there are quite a few sensory modalities, there are also lots of different types of receptors. So you'll see that we'll assign each receptor a structural classification as well as a functional classification. So the first type of receptor classification we're going to go over are the structural classifications. So our body's sensory receptors can be classified into three different groups. We have free nerve endings, encapsulated nerve endings, and different cells that serve as the receptor themselves. So the first group, the free nerve endings, are simply bare dendrites. Since dendrites receive signals, those dendrites are going to be specialized to take in information regarding one of our sensory modalities. So we'll see free nerve endings often bringing in information regarding to some type of tactile sensory modalities. So free nerve endings will often deal with pain, thermal stimuli, as well as different types of touch sensations. Encapsulated nerve endings contain some type of capsule. Encapsulated nerve endings are a type of structural classification for our sensory receptors, where we have a capsule that's made up of some type of connective tissue. That capsule is going to wrap around our dendrites and act as an accessory to monitor different other sensory modalities that we weren't able to monitor with just free nerve endings. So encapsulated nerve endings are free nerve endings that are wrapped in some type of capsule. And our last structural classification are separate cells. Oftentimes entire cells act as the receptor, and then those cells will pass their information on to other types of cells. So we will especially see separate cells when we talk about our special senses. The photoreceptors in the eyes, the gustatory receptor cells in the tongue, and the olfactory receptor cells found within the olfactory epithelium are all going to be separate cells that bring in their respective information and send it back to the central nervous system. So this slide just shows us a diagram of what each of these look like. You can see the free nerve endings, which are the dendrites of this sensory neuron shown here. We call these free nerve endings because the dendrites are simply branching out freely. Encapsulated nerve endings are just dendrites that are wrapped in some type of connective tissue capsule, and the capsule is what's specialized to allow for the reception of whatever sensory modality it is that we're looking for. And lastly, other cells themselves can also serve as sensory receptors. This is a gustatory receptor cell, which is one of the cells that we find in the tongue that sense taste. These cells are going to have some way that they can monitor the chemical stimuli coming in to the tongue, and whenever these cells are activated by whatever chemical stimuli it is that they receive, they're going to send additional neurotransmitters to let this sensory neuron know that they have received their signal. Now, I said that there are lots of ways that we can classify our receptors, and there's actually two different functional classifications that we can give. One of those criteria is the origin of the stimuli that's activating that receptor. And this will also relate to the location of the receptor as well. But the other functional classification that we can give to our receptors is by the type of stimuli that that receptor is receiving. So the functional classifications shown on this slide are based on the origin of the stimuli. Does the stimuli come from the external environment, or does it come from the internal environment? And we'll see in a couple slides that we can also classify receptors based on the type of stimuli that they're detecting. But let's go over these ones first. So first and foremost here we have exteroceptors, and we also have interoceptors. Exteroceptors are often located closer to the outside of our bodies. Exteroceptors are bringing in information that relates to the external environment. So this is a very broad group of receptors. All of our special sensory receptors can be found in here, as well as all of our somatic receptors. So vision, smell, touch, pain, all of these different types of sensory modalities are coming from the external environment. Interoceptors, on the other hand, receive information regarding our body's internal environment. These receptors are sensing sensory modalities such as the acidity levels in our stomach, how hungry we are, and nauseousness. Other examples of interoceptors will monitor our body's blood pressure. Our third classification of receptors are the proprioceptors. These receptors are giving us information about our body's current position. So the sensory receptors of the stretch and the tendon reflexes will be proprioceptors. So most often these receptors are going to be found close to the sensory information that they're going to be receiving. Since the exteroceptors are bringing in information about the external environment, these are going to more often be located closer to the body's surface that is going to be contacting the external environment. And the same trend is true with interoceptors. Interoceptors are going to be found towards the inside of our bodies because they're going to be monitoring the body's internal environment. And in order for sensory information to make its way into the sensory receptor, those receptors need to be in the vicinity of that sensory information. So the proprioceptors can be found in the muscles and the joints because they're giving us information about muscle stretch and the positioning of our joints, but we'll also find these in the inner ear, because there's a portion of the inner ear that gives us information about our body's equilibrium. And we will discuss that in more detail in Chapter 17. Now this slide shows us our other way that we can functionally classify receptors. And this is based on the type of stimulus that that receptor is receiving. So there's quite a few of these. We have mechanoreceptors, thermoreceptors, nociceptors, photoreceptors, and chemoreceptors. Each of these receptors is appropriately named based on the information it's receiving. So mechanoreceptors monitor mechanical stimuli. This is going to be stimuli related to touch, stretch, and vibration. Physical deformation is mechanical stimuli. Thermoreceptors are going to be monitoring temperature changes, and chemoreceptors are going to be monitoring chemical changes. We often find chemoreceptors in the mouth and in the nose because our taste and olfactory senses will sense the structures of different molecules. Photoreceptors are found in the eye, and these receptors will receive light information and convert that into vision information that we can perceive. Now hopefully you can deduce based on the name of the receptors what each of those receptors does. However, there's this other class of receptors that we probably haven't heard so much about before. Nociceptors are a group of receptors that receive painful stimuli. And nociceptors can be closely related to chemoreceptors, thermoceptors, and mechanoreceptors as well. Mechanical stimuli refers to touch. But if that touch turns into a very hard pinch, or perhaps a very sharp object that is pushing into our skin, that can then turn into painful stimuli. Warm water might feel rather pleasant, but when that water gets very hot, that's going to activate nociceptors as well. So nociceptors are additional receptors that are monitoring different types of pain stimuli. Pain, while very unpleasant, actually serves a very important purpose in the body. The reason that our bodies feel pain is because painful stimuli often indicate when some type of stimulus is going to be damaging to our tissues. This is a protective mechanism that's shown by our bodies that helps to motivate us to remove tissue-damaging stimuli from our external environment. So while we might not personally be a fan of the nociceptors, they do play a very vital role in our body's homeostasis. So somatic sensation refer to our body's ability to sense the external environment. These somatic sensations come from receptors that are found monitoring the external environment. Now there are 4 modalities that give us somatic sensations, and those modalities are tactile sensations, thermal sensations, pain sensations, and proprioceptive sensations. Our tactile sensation is what gives us information about touch, how hard or how soft our bodies are being touched. Thermal sensations give us information about temperature, so warm versus cold, and we'll use thermoreceptors to monitor thermal somatic sensations. I explained on the last slide that pain stimuli is brought in by nociceptors, and this little bit right here is also mentioning what I said on the last slide about the importance of pain. Pain signals conditions that can possibly damage tissues, and that allows and motivates us to remove that painful stimuli. And lastly are the proprioceptive somatic sensations. Proprioceptive sensations allow us to recognize certain parts of our bodies and the positions of our bodies in reference to each other. This is how, if we close our eyes and raise our arms above our heads, we're still aware that our arms are above our heads even though we can't see them. So I'm going to specifically go over some tactile receptors that we find in the skin. These are receptors that you'll specifically be going over in the Anatomy and Physiology 2 lab, but I want to get a head start on some of this information. So the 3 receptors that we find related to tactile information inside of the skin are the Pacinian corpuscle, the Meissner corpuscle, and the hair root plexus. The Meissner corpuscle, also known as the corpuscle of touch, can be found very superficially located in the dermis, specifically in the papillary layer. The Meissner corpuscles will sense low-frequency vibrations, or light touch. And these are in contrast to the Pacinian corpuscles, which can be found very deep in the reticular layer of the dermis. The Pacinian corpuscle will sense high-frequency vibrations, or deep touch. So let's compare the 2 of these. The Meissner corpuscle senses light touch, and it's found very superficial in the dermis. Touch is a type of mechanical stimuli, so this is going to be a mechanoreceptor. When the skin is touched, it's going to undergo some type of physical deformation. Whatever is touching the skin is going to push down into the skin and deform all of these cells and push them downwards. The bending and invagination of the skin will eventually reach the Meissner corpuscle. And if that pressure gets hard enough, that's eventually going to also mechanically stimulate the Pacinian corpuscle, which senses deep touch. So as we deform the skin with light touch, we're only producing very minor mechanical deformations. But even though those deformations are minor, the Meissner corpuscle is found very superficially, so it will sense those deformations first, before the Pacinian corpuscle does. And that's how we can remember that the Meissner corpuscle found more superficially in the skin senses light touch, and the Pacinian corpuscle senses deep touch. The Pacinian corpuscle is found much deeper, so it's just simply going to take more pressure to stimulate that Pacinian corpuscle. Now, another little trick I have for you all to remember the Pacinian corpuscle is that the Pacinian corpuscle has this capsule, and this capsule has different layers, and based on these different layers in this entire capsule, this whole thing sort of resembles an onion. Just as an onion has lots of layers once it's sliced, the Pacinian corpuscle looks the same way. So I prefer to call this the Pacinian corpuscle, To help me remember what this sensory receptor looks like, and the way that I remember that this senses deep touch is that onions will grow deep within the ground. So hopefully that little trick helps you to remember these two different types of sensory receptors. Now the last type of sensory receptor is the hair root plexus, and this is this plexus of nerves that wraps around each of these hair follicles and hair roots. The hair root plexus is what senses the movement of hairs on the outside of the body. So this is why we can touch our hairs and actually feel that without even touching the body. So these are the three sensory receptors that I'd like you to feel comfortable with. Again, you will get the Pacinian and the Meissner corpuscle when you get into A&P2, but I'd like you to have an idea of what each of these are and what type of sensation is sensed by each.